Today is May 14th, 1987. This is Joe, Todd, and Bernice Jackson, an interview with George Sunderland in Woodward, Oklahoma. So where were you born?
Born in Munster, Texas. It's a small town down by Wichita Falls.
And when's your birthday?
November 26th, 21.
Who is your father?
George Edward Sunderland, George E. Sunderland.
And your mother?
Phoebe Jane Sunderland.
What was her maiden name?
Her name was Foster.
Foster.
That was her stepdad's name.
Okay. Where were your parents from?
Well, my dad was born in Belvedere, Kansas, and my mother was born up here north of Woodward, about 20 miles north of Woodward.
Mm-hmm.
And his folks came from up in Iowa, I think, my dad's folks.
Were either one of your grandfathers in the Civil War?
Well, my grandfather Sunderland, I suppose I kind of think maybe he might have been. I can't really say for sure. I remember my grandmother a lot more, and I don't really remember seeing my grandfather.
Why did the family move to Oklahoma?
Well, they were brought up north of Woodward, about just really across the road from each other. So my dad worked on the railroad, and he'd been up and down the line from Wichita Falls to Woodward, and he just decided this would be a good area. At the time, my dad's folks, I think, came in on the run, I believe, and I'm not real sure when my mother's stepdad came from Switzerland. His name was Todd, and he married a Foster, and she was his stepdaughter. Her name was Foster, Phoebe Jane Foster, my mother.
So your father worked for the railroad?
Yes,
And
he worked several years.
What railroad is it?
Well, I was thinking the Rock Island. I know the Katy runs back and forth north and south, but I kind of think he worked for the Rock Island.
And when did the family move to Woodward? What year?
Well, I went in the Army in 1940, and I imagine they moved here probably in 43 or 44, because I was overseas at the time.
So you lived in Texas until
Till I was 2 weeks old.
And
then they moved up in this area up here. They have lived in Kansas City, and we lived I had 12 years of schooling at May, Oklahoma, just 25 miles west of here. If I can keep from, my wife doesn't appreciate my banging on something, so I better quit.
That's okay. How big was May in those days?
Well, it never has been very big. Could have been as many as 500 or 600 people, I guess, probably.
And how big was the school at May?
Well, the year I graduated, I think there were 18 seniors, I believe. And we had it wasn't a very big school, probably grade school, probably 50, 60 children in the grade.
And you graduated in what year?
1940.
1940.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any chores around the house when you lived in May?
Yeah, we had a pump on the back porch, and I brought the water in, which was not very far, but I had to go down in the pasture down just north of us, quarter of a mile. It's only about a quarter of a mile down to the river, the Beaver River, and I went down and brought up kindling and driftwood and firewood to keep our cook stove going, and I down got up and started a fire every morning. And we had a Detroit Jewel cook stove, I think, and a heating stove, and had a furnace. And we, of course, we used coal too. We used a lot of cow chips to keep our fires burning. So it was back that far.
And was Maine mainly a farming or ranching town?
Yes, The Katy Railroad went through there, which helped them quite a bit. They had an elevator and a couple of filling stations and a couple of grocery stores and a drugstore and a post office. It was a pretty good little town.
Yeah, not much left there anymore, though.
No, they still have a post office.
Yeah.
What did your father do when you were living in Maine?
Well, he worked for WPA mostly, or PWA, whichever it is, Public Works Administration. He had a 28 Chevrolet truck, and they fixed this road, the road between May and Englewood, Kansas. They worked on that up north of Laverne, and he drove this truck, this 28 Chevrolet truck, and furnished transportation for some of the rest of them that worked up there. And it was a pretty good truck for those days.
Was he a supervisor on the?
Well, yeah, kinda, yeah. He was.
Who was in charge of all the road work in Oklahoma for the WPA?
I really can't say. At the time, I was not very concerned about. I knew my dad was getting $23 on a dime a month, and that was a lot of money back then. We survived on it, and my dad and mom, they had 10 children, so at the time there was about 7 or 8 of us at home, children, just the children. So we were surviving on that.
How bad were the dust storms around May?
Well, they were bad. A cousin of mine, we lived down in the northeast part of town, and Donald Robertson was cousin, and we spent most of our time all down the corner, about a quarter of a block west of where we lived. We lived in my grandmother's house, and grandmother Sunderland, and we'd be down there on the corner, wrestling around, and shoving each other's faces in the dirt and so forth. We were around 15, I guess, 16, and this evening, about 6 o'clock this evening, we both looked up, and back off in the west, there was the awfulest black dust storm you ever saw, and we both headed for the house, and it was, the dirt was terrible. That wind bringing it across there and hitting you in the face, just sandstorms, and it was rough. It was rough on everybody.
How'd you keep that dust out of the house?
Well, we really didn't. We just lived in a little old house, and actually we didn't keep it out, I guess. I don't recall it being all that bad after you got in the house, but it wasn't as bad as these tornadoes that we had that problem with. And I can't recall it. We knew it was terrible. We never had any thoughts about leaving, like a lot of people got up and left. But we were living in town. We didn't have a farm or anything to try to make it on.
So you joined the Army in 1940?
1940.
What month and day?
August the 3rd, 1940.
Why did you join the Army?
Well, probably for the same reason my son did this past couple of years ago, because there wasn't anything. I didn't know what I was going to do if I didn't. There just wasn't anything to do. There at May, it was all kind of an agricultural farming community, and there just wasn't nothing there. We did have work on the dam up at Supply. They were building the dam at the time, and my dad worked on that some, and I worked on it that summer, but it wasn't really, it was money in your pocket, but it wasn't very much, and I just decided maybe the Army would be a better place. Wasn't no place to get rich, because I was getting, at the time we was getting $21 a month, and about 5 or 6 of that went in your pocket. And
Where did you take your basic?
so, I started at Fort Bliss, Texas. I was in the cavalry, in the 8th Cavalry, Fort Bliss, Texas, and my mother said that's too far away from home, so she wrote the commanding officer and had me moved to Fort Sill, and I spent about 3 years at Fort Sill, down at Lawton.
Tell me about the maneuvers in the cavalry.
Well, down at Fort Bliss, we had at one time they had a 3-day weekend, whatever you would call it, jaunt or something. I didn't want to go, so at the time I had practice, my nose would bleed real easy, and so about halfway to keep from going made my nose bleed and kept from going. But I guess it was a nice weekend trip. They went to Carlsbad Caverns, and we took the horses and had a good time. But I probably stayed home and worked KP. I hadn't stayed in.
Tell me about your basic at Fort Sill. What happened
Well, the main thing we did, I was in the Field Artillery Battalion, and the main thing we did, we worked in the survey section, and we had these 75mm guns and caissons and what have you. And I can remember our red-headed little survey sergeant, and he was a pretty nice guy with us, and that's just pretty well what we did. We learned all the aim and circle, and learned to plot, learned to ranges and distances and so forth. Mainly what we did. Spent a lot of time in down in the stable cleaning up after the horses. We had horses down there you wouldn't hardly believe. They were these big old gray Percheron stallions, and they used those to pull a wagon down to where they unloaded them. But you could sit on one of those horses and you never would fall off. They were really something. They were about that broad, these big old gray horses, and they were really something. I was exercising my captain's horse one day, and I was on a little short-legged horse we called Hackney, and my captain's horse's name was King, and we were doing fine, and this long-legged horse of the captain got stretching his leg a little bit, and we couldn't keep up, so he got away, and I was after him, and the Hackney, this little horse I was on, kind of went head over heels, stuck his foot in a gopher hole. I had a old busted shoulder, and spent about 4 months in the hospital, and that was Pearl Harbor happened while I was in the hospital. I've been in there for a couple months.
Did you go on the Louisiana maneuvers?
No, never did. I never really. Well, we went out. The main thing we did, we went out in the field just around Fort Sill and Cache Creek and Medicine Park, and we had all the Wichita Mountain Range was down there. And wintertime we'd go up there and do just what. Tried to stay inside as much as we could. It was cold up there, but you could freeze your hands off. But really, that's about all in the way of maneuvers or anything that we did.
When did you go overseas?
Probably about March of '44. I spent a year. I went from Fort Sill out to Fort Ord, California as cadre, training cadre, and we ran up and down the beaches there, hardening our legs and training recruits. And I spent about a year there, and then went up to San Francisco and disembarked there and went South Pacific, down New Caledonia.
Tell me about the trip over to New Caledonia.
Huh?
Anything happened on the trip over?
Well, it took us, we was on about 3,000 of us on a Dutch ship, the Polar Lock. And we done a lot of dodging, a lot of zigzagging, of course, because at that time there were submarines, and the Germans had submarines over there in the Pacific Ocean. And we passed by Hawaiian Islands and Christmas Island both at night, and 45 days down there we were on the ocean. And the first 3 days out I had a few problems with trying to keep from getting sick, but after that, well, we done just fine.
In New Caledonia, was it pretty well cleaned out with Japanese, or were there still Japanese
Yeah,
there?
there wasn't, no, not as I recall, there wasn't any. By the time I got overseas in April or May, first part of May, I imagine the Japs were, the Marines had taken care of a lot of them.
What unit were you a member of?
Well, I was in the Americal Division, and I was in the 45th Field Artillery Battalion in the Americal, yeah.
Was that
we
part
left.
of the Oklahoma National Guard?
Well, no, I was in the regular Army. See, I joined the regular Army. 16 months after I went in, they didn't start the draft.
Yeah.
For 16 months after I went in. So I was in the regular Army. But it was just, they'd formed what they call Americal Division is, I guess, Americans and New Caledonians. That's where the name came from, I guess. And we went down there as the 45th Field Artillery Battalion, and we landed there, well, they said in the rainy season, but I think it rained all year long there. They put us up north of Noumea, that little French town. It was French New Caledonia, and put us up there, and it was red mud all the time we were there. We were in red mud. Just,
what campaigns were you in during the war?
well, I was on the way up north from New Caledonia. Well, we stopped overnight in Guadalcanal. We never really got off the ship. But Bougainville, I was in the Bougainville campaign. And by the time we got there, while the Japanese were pretty well driven back in the hills. But we did make trips out there. We had Torquino River. We crossed it 7 times with the water about here. We'd carry our rifles up here and hold on to each other, and 7 times to get out, kind of in the area where the Japanese had pulled back. And I was only 20, 21 years old, 20, 21, and we kind of enjoyed it. I never did really mind being over there.
Were you in any actual frontline combat?
No, not really. And from Bougainville, they sent us into the Philippines, and we made initial landing on Leyte. And
what was that like?
Huh?
What was that like?
Well, it was kind of scary. You know, it's the first landing we'd actually made, but we'd heard the Japanese were pretty well pulled back. We got in there about 6 o'clock one evening, and the first thing we saw was a black P-51 come over and it's painted black, well, because of course, the war and everything. But it was a welcome sight for us. It was a lot better than seeing Japanese warplanes coming in. So.
Were you in the Army of Occupation?
Yeah, we spent about 6 months in Tokyo.
I was going to ask, what did you do in VJ Day?
Well, It was, when we heard it, it's about 6 o'clock, I believe Wednesday evening, I believe. And we liked the sound of it because we knew we was pretty well on our way to try to take Japan, and that wasn't going to be any great thing.
What was your reaction when you heard about the bomb?
Well, the only reason I liked it, I guess, was because of the fact it ended the war. I don't think anybody much cared for it. I didn't, here, and of course, if the same thing happened to us, I know how we'd feel about it. And millions of Japanese, it wasn't too good, but it looked like that's what it was going to take to end the war. Wasn't a whole lot we could do. I wouldn't have wanted to have been the president at the time when he had to decide and had to decide to do it. Kind of a bad situation.
And you were in the occupation army where?
Well, we went right straight up got on a ship and went right straight from Philippines up to Japan. I was on a ship in the harbor, in Tokyo Harbor, the Missouri, USS Missouri. I was on night duty on guard there, and they there for probably a week. Then they took us up north of Tokyo, and we were occupation. It's only about 6 months, I think, probably, army occupation. And I don't really remember the Japanese people. I don't remember having very much to do with them. I guess we were kind of aloof, just like they were.
Yeah. When did you get your discharge?
In October the 30th, 1945. I was discharged at Fort Logan, Colorado.
And you came back to Woodward?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what kind of work did you do at that time?
Well, I went to work for REA, and I worked 10.5 years, this REC they call it now, but about 10.5 years. Then I left there and went to the post office about 13.5 years. So, and after that I worked out here at the Woodward Manufacturing, mostly as a night watchman, about 8-9 years there.
April 9th, 1947. Tornado.
Yeah, it was Wednesday night, and my brothers and sisters were at, well, most of them were at the Nazarene Church down at 5th in Texas. But I had a sister, Patty, it's Patty Denny now, that her and Irvin, her husband, now, they weren't married at the time, but they were in the Woodward Theater, and my other sisters and a brother were at the Nazarene Church, and they put them under the benches, I guess. But my mom and I were at home, and all we got, living out there just about where she lives now, 1816 Second. And we, actually, she was living in the same block, but it was 112M. And the house isn't there now. It's Elm Street Baptist Church location. But the lights went out, and I climbed up in the attic and brought a lamp down, and all that wind, of course, like I said, just a hard straight wind there in the southeast portion of Woodward. And she had a chicken coop out in the backyard, and it blew away with the chickens. And
How close were you to the funnel cloud?
Well, it was actually just about straight across town, northwest, probably a mile, at least a mile away from it, maybe a little more, mile and a quarter. She had an aunt that lived up on Kansas Avenue, Kansas Street, and it blew their house away, and a lot of their things, well, they found a Bible of hers about 10, 12 miles north of Woodward, and they had some strange things take place. They had like straws driven through trees, and that tornado. It was. I've seen pictures of it since, and that's about as bad as.
Yeah.
That's about as bad as anything.
Did you help them to clean up or help
Well,
them?
I did a little bit looking around that night. We were, of course, there were no lights, and they had an emergency generator at the hospital, which was up here on 4th Street at the time. But really, I never picked up anybody. I heard a lot and saw a lot of. But I was up at the hospital, and they brought in a lot of people there. People had splinters, just splinters through and through, and I guess they were lucky that they didn't get more people killed.
How many were killed in that tornado?
Well, they say about 105, I think. So there was I think they say about I don't know, quarter of a mile swath, I guess, through the town, and they said kind of followed the railroad and kind of followed the river down here from White Deer, Texas, and through Higgins, Texas, and down through Shattuck and Gage and Fargo. There was a bunch of, well, of course, this is all, I don't know whether you've ever heard the tape that they made up.
Yeah, I heard that.
But yeah, these guys on the elevator, sitting up at the elevator, on top of the elevator at Fargo, stood there and watched it, I guess, coming, and they were lucky enough that, but it pretty well followed the railroad, I guess, down through here, and ended up, there was a lady lived west of the Oasis down here, and she lost her husband and had a couple of boys, and she moved to Olathe, Kansas, and she got the same thing up there that she did. They had a tornado after she moved there. She got into another one.
Well, we just talked about tornado. Talk about the Army discharge.
Wasn't there a Sunderland business house here in Woodward or May or somewhere? A lumber yard or something?
Sutherland.
Southern.
Uh-huh.
Southern.
No, I had a second cousin that was police chief here, Don Sunderland, was police chief here at the time, and then he went into business, one of these quick stop places.
What kind of business have you been in since you got out of the Army?
Well, I carried mail for about 13 years. I carried pretty well all over town. When I started, there was one house on 21st Street, and that was as far out as it came. None of this out here.
This is Newport.
Yeah. There was one house on 21st, and it belonged to the fire chief.
You didn't go out in the country. You didn't deliver mail out in the country.
No.
Just here in town.
Just put carrier.
So you're a retired mail carrier then?
Yeah. Yeah, I had to quit with 13 and a half years service. I had a heart attack in '68, and I didn't carry after that.
What else?
Did you go on to college or anything?
No, I got out of the Army, and we had a Woodward Junior College here, and I went for about 2 weeks, and the money wasn't forthcoming. It looked like it's going to be a little while, and I need to go to work. So, but I had while I was overseas, we never received any. I think $15, I think, was all the money I received, because we didn't need it over there. The Filipino people there in the Philippines were real good to us. You could give them a T-shirt, and they'd give you a stalk of bananas, that you could eat on forever, I guess.
Were they proud that the Americans were there?
Yeah. They appreciated the Americans a lot more than they did the Japanese. They never had any use. We were on the island of Cebu while we were over there, and they had a Spanish college, white people in that college, and they claimed that they were collaborationists. They collaborated with the Japanese, and Filipino people didn't like them. They didn't care for them at all. But the American people got along pretty well with the Filipinos. But, like I said, most of the fighting was pretty well over by the time I went over there. We didn't really have, I did have one, the first night we landed in the Philippines, it was, just about nighttime, so it was time for us to go to bed, and I crawled up on this mound of dirt here, and it was fine, just a blanket, and we never needed coats all the time we were over there, just a blanket, and I woke up the next morning, and I was laying on top of this pile of dirt, and there was arms and legs sticking out. Japanese, they'd buried a bunch of Japanese, just covered them up with dirt.
That was good.
It must have been just recent, then it must have just done it because there was no odor or anything like that. It just.
And what was your job while you were in the Army?
I was in what we call the survey section, working with directing, fire control on these 75 millimeter guns, artillery. And we did pretty well. We worked with aiming circles and transits and things like that.
You weren't out in danger of
Well, we
combat.
usually had to go out in front because we never was really, I never was in any actual fighting combat, but we did, while we were in the Philippines here, we'd be standing on this hill over here, and the Japanese maybe a quarter mile away would be standing on this, and it'd be raining, it could be raining here, and you could step over here, and it just cut off at about 4 o'clock every day while it'd be raining.
Well.
And we'd stand there and take a shower, and the Japanese were over here doing the same thing.
You were taking a shower from the rain shower.
We'd, laying up on, at night, we was up at the top, kind of up on a hill. The Japanese were down here at the bottom. Banzai, banzai. We'd have hand grenades there, and we'd toss hand grenades over down the hill. We'd kind of behind old fortification, we'd kind of build up sandbanks or something. But they never really got any closer than that. So I never really had.
They didn't throw any back at you?
No. I never really felt like I was in much danger while I was over there, but.
Were you married while you were overseas?
No, I didn't get married to a wife I have now, my second wife. I have a fairly young family. I have a little 20-month-old red-headed grandson.
First wife didn't have any children?
She had some of her own, and we had a girl. She would be 32 years old now, I guess, but I never do hear from her.
Well.
About 3 years ago, I was having a real bad time with my heart, and had open heart surgery. I had 2 bypasses. And she called the hospital from Irving, Texas, said if we'd furnish a little money, send her a little money, she'd come up there. But we didn't have the money, and I haven't seen her in 3 years. I guess 4 years I haven't seen her.
Well.
Haven't even heard from her, so.
Well,
Your wife must be a young lady.
She's about 15 years younger than I am. She's not what they call a senior citizen yet.
Well, this has been nice. I'm glad you
Well,
come.
I hope I'm giving you something you could use.
Oh,
That
yeah.
I kind of rambled,
This
I
is
guess.
a different phase of the war
Oh, yeah.
than what we've had. And that's what we want.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.